The bulldozer's engine roared to life at exactly 6 a.m., its massive steel blade gleaming in the morning sun as it rolled toward my great-grandfather's century-old oak tree. I stood on my front porch, coffee mug trembling in my hands, watching Margaret Hensley, the HOA president, with her perfectly coiffed silver hair and $1,000 pantsuit point directly at the ancient tree that had weathered more storms than she'd ever face in her privileged life. "Take it down, Jerry," she commanded the operator, like some twisted queen ordering an execution. Every last branch. The blade scraped against the bark, and I felt something snap inside me. This wasn't just about a tree anymore. This was war. But Margaret had no idea what she'd just awakened. She didn't know that the quiet ranch owner she'd been terrorizing for months had access to every single property record, deed, and legal document in the entire county. She didn't know that my seemingly modest job at the county records office had given me keys to secrets that would bring her whole empire crashing down. As that bulldozer prepared to destroy 4 generations of my family's history, I pulled out my phone and made a call that would change everything. "Sheriff Martinez? This is Elena Vasquez from the records office. I need you out at Willow Creek Ranch immediately. We have a major legal situation developing." The look of smug satisfaction on Margaret's face was about to become something very different. I should have seen it coming the day I inherited the ranch from my grandfather, Miguel Vasquez. The property had been in our family since 1923, when my great-grandfather bought 847 acres of prime Texas hill country for practically nothing. Over the decades, suburban sprawl had crept closer, but our land remained untouched rolling pastures, that magnificent oak tree, and the original stone farmhouse that had sheltered 4 generations of Vasquez family. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, stamped with the official seal of Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I remember laughing at first, thinking someone had made a mistake. "Notice of property non-compliance," I read aloud to my border collie, Rex, who tilted his head like he couldn't believe it either. "The Willowbrook Estates, HOA, hereby notifies property owner Elena Vasquez that the following violations must be remedied within 30 days. The list was absurd. Failure to maintain regulation grass height, unapproved exterior paint color, presence of livestock in residential area, and my personal favorite, non-compliant architectural features, including but not limited to wooden fencing and metal roofing." I crumpled the letter and tossed it in the fireplace. My ranch existed decades before any HOA, and I'd be damned if some suburban development was going to tell me how to live on my own land. That was my first mistake, underestimating Margaret Hensley. The second letter arrived a week later, this time via certified mail. The tone had shifted from bureaucratic politeness to barely veiled threats. Margaret had personally signed this one, her signature A aggressive slash across expensive letterhead. Final notice: failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in legal action and potential foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure? On land my family had owned for a century? I called the number on the letterhead, my hands shaking with rage. "Willowbrook Estates, HOA, this is Cindy speaking. How may I help you?" "This is Elena Vasquez. I received this ridiculous letter claiming your HOA has authority over my ranch. I think there's been some kind of mistake." A pause. "Let me transfer you to Mrs. Hensley." The voice that came on the line was ice cold and razor sharp. "Miss Vasquez, there's no mistake. Your property falls within the jurisdiction of our homeowners association as of the recent boundary expansion approved by the county." Boundary expansion? I never agreed to. You didn't need to agree. The county commissioners voted unanimously to expand our association's authority. You're now subject to all covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I suggest you review the documentation and bring your property into compliance immediately." The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen that night, staring at the letter by lamplight, Rex's head heavy on my feet. Outside, the oak tree's branches swayed in the evening breeze, its leaves whispering secrets that only my family had heard for generations. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory. Mija, this land is our legacy. Never let anyone take what belongs to us. But how could I fight an entire HOA with legal authority and unlimited resources? That's when I remembered something that would change everything. My day job wasn't just filing papers and answering phones at the county records office. As the senior records clerk, I had access to every deed, every boundary survey, every legal document that had ever been filed in our county. If Margaret wanted to play legal games, I had the keys to the entire game board. The next morning, I walked into work with a new purpose. My supervisor, Mrs. Chen, barely looked up from her computer as I settled at my desk. "Morning, Elena. Got those property transfers ready for the courthouse?" "Almost finished," I replied, already pulling up the county's digital mapping system. "Mrs. Chen, I need to research some boundary changes. Where would I find the records for HOA jurisdiction expansions?" She glanced over her reading glasses. Section 4BE, blue filing cabinets. Everything from 1985 forward should be digitized too. Why? Personal research project. What I discovered in the next 3 hours would have made my grandfather proud and Margaret Hensley sick to her stomach. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had been established in 1997 when developer Harrison Klein bought 2,000 acres and built a luxury subdivision. The original HOA boundaries were clearly defined in the county records, and my ranch wasn't even close to being included. But here's where it got interesting. In March, just 2 months before I inherited the ranch, someone had filed a boundary modification request with the county planning department. The request claimed that recent survey corrections had revealed measurement errors in the original HOA boundaries, and that several properties previously thought to be outside the association were actually within its jurisdiction. The modification request was signed by all 5 county commissioners and stamped with official approval. On paper, it looked completely legitimate. But I'd been working in this office for 8 years. I knew every commissioner personally, and I knew their signatures. The signatures on this document were forgeries, good ones, but forgeries nonetheless. Someone had committed fraud to steal my ranch. I pulled up the digital records for every property within the expanded HOA boundaries. My ranch wasn't the only target. The modification had brought 12 properties under HOA control, all of them valuable, land owned by longtime families, all of them now subject to Margaret Hensley's rules. My hands trembled as I printed out every page of evidence. But knowing about the fraud was just the beginning. I needed to understand who was behind it and why. That answer came when I cross-referenced the property tax records with the recent sales in Willowbrook Estates. Over the past year, Margaret's husband, David Hensley, had quietly purchased 6 properties from families who couldn't afford to bring their land into HOA compliance. He'd bought them for pennies on the dollar, then flipped them to developers for massive profits. They weren't just enforcing rules. They were stealing land. And my ranch, with its prime location and water rights, would be their biggest score yet. I made copies of everything and locked them in my car before returning to my desk. Margaret had played dirty, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed I was just another victim who would roll over and let her steal my family's legacy. She had no idea she'd just declared war on someone with access to every dirty secret in the county files. The first inspection happened 3 days after my phone call with Margaret. I was mucking out the horse stalls when a white Escalade rolled up my gravel driveway, kicking up dust clouds that spooked my mare, Esperanza. Margaret emerged wearing a crisp white blazer and heels that had no business being on a working ranch. Behind her came 2 men in matching polo shirts, carrying clipboards and cameras. Ms. Vasquez, Margaret announced, not bothering with pleasantries. We're here to conduct the mandatory property inspection referenced in your compliance notice. This is private property, I replied, not moving from where I stood. You have no right to be here. Margaret's smile was all teeth and no warmth. According to county records, this property falls under HOA jurisdiction. We have every right to ensure compliance with community standards. She nodded to her companions, who immediately began photographing everything: the barn, the chicken coop, my vegetable garden, even Rex as he barked from the porch. Note the unpermitted structures, she dictated while one man scribbled notes. Animal waste odors clearly violate the community health standards. And that tree, she pointed at my great-grandfather's oak, is a clear safety hazard. The branches extend over the property line. What property line? I demanded. My nearest neighbor is half a mile away. The HOA common area boundary, Margaret replied smoothly. The expansion brought several parcels under community management for the greater good of property values. I wanted to tell her exactly what she could do with her property values, but I held my tongue. Let her think I was intimidated. Let her believe she was winning. After an hour of photographing, measuring, and making notes, Margaret approached me with a thick folder. Your formal violation notice, she said, handing it over. You have 45 days to remediate all issues or face legal action. The tree removal alone will cost approximately $15,000, but I'm sure you'll find it's worth maintaining good relationships with your neighbors. As her Escalade disappeared down the driveway, I opened the folder. The violation list had grown from 5 items to 23, including failure to maintain appropriate livestock containment, unapproved garden vegetables visible from roadway, and non-standard fence materials creating visual pollution. The estimated remediation cost, $127,000. They weren't trying to bring my property into compliance. They were trying to bankrupt me into selling. That evening, I called my cousin Maria, who worked as a paralegal in San Antonio. Elena, this sounds like organized fraud, she said after I explained the situation. But fighting an HOA is expensive, and if they have the county's backing. What if they don't really have the county's backing? What do you mean? I took a deep breath. What if I could prove they forged the boundary expansion documents? Silence on the other end. Then, Elena, that's a serious accusation. If you're wrong, they'll destroy you in court. If you're right. If I'm right? If you're right, they go to prison. Margaret wasn't content to wait for my response. 2 weeks later, a county code enforcement officer knocked on my door at 7 a.m. Behind him stood Margaret and a man I didn't recognize carrying surveying equipment. Ma'am, I'm Officer Rodriguez with County Code Enforcement. We've received multiple complaints about your property. I need to conduct an inspection. My heart sank. If the county was involved, maybe the boundary expansion was legitimate after all. What kind of complaints? I asked. Officer Rodriguez consulted his clipboard. Reports of unpermitted structures, livestock in residential zones, and potential environmental violations. As he spoke, I noticed Margaret whispering to the surveyor, who was setting up his equipment near my oak tree. Something about their body language seemed off, too familiar, too coordinated. The inspection lasted 3 hours. Officer Rodriguez was professional but thorough, taking measurements and photographs of every structure on my property. The surveyor worked separately, establishing new boundary markers that seemed to place portions of my ranch in different zones than I'd ever seen on official maps. Miss Vasquez, Officer Rodriguez said as he finished, I'm not seeing any major code violations. Your structures appear to predate current zoning requirements, so they're grandfathered in. The livestock appears properly contained and managed. Relief flooded through me until I saw Margaret's face. She looked furious. Officer Rodriguez, she interjected, I think you missed the environmental impact assessment. The runoff from the livestock areas is clearly affecting the community water table. Rodriguez looked confused. Ma'am, I wasn't asked to conduct an environmental assessment. That would require a different type of inspection, and then we'll need to schedule one, Margaret snapped. The community has rights too. After they left, I stood in my yard, feeling like a prey animal being circled by predators. Every interaction felt orchestrated, every inspection designed to find new ways to attack my right to live on my own land. That afternoon, I decided to do some reconnaissance of my own. The Willowbrook Estate subdivision was 15 minutes from my ranch, a maze of identical McMansions with perfect lawns and 3-car garages. I parked at the community center and walked around, noting the cameras, the manicured landscaping, the signs warning that the area was under 24-hour HOA surveillance. At the community mailbox cluster, I struck up a conversation with a woman walking her designer dog. Beautiful neighborhood, I said casually. Oh, thank you. We love it here. Very well-managed community. She paused, studying my dusty jeans and boots. Are you looking at buying? I should mention, the HOA is very strict about maintaining standards. I actually live just outside the community. Elena Vasquez, from the old ranch. Her expression changed immediately. Oh, you're the one causing all the trouble. Trouble? Margaret Hensley told us about the environmental hazards from your livestock and the property value impacts. She gathered her dog's leash tighter. I hope you'll do the right thing and bring your property into compliance. We have children here. As I walked back to my truck, I realized Margaret had been conducting a propaganda campaign, turning my neighbors against me before I even knew we were neighbors. But her campaign had one flaw. She'd made me sound like a much bigger threat than I actually was. A small organic ranch with a few horses and chickens wasn't exactly an environmental disaster, which meant she was lying about more than just the boundary expansion. That night, I returned to the county records office for some after-hours research. Using my keycard access, I pulled every environmental assessment filed in the past 2 years within a 10-mile radius of Willowbrook Estates. What I found made my blood run cold. 3 separate environmental consulting firms had filed reports documenting groundwater contamination, soil toxicity, and improper waste management within the Willowbrook Estates development. The contamination was coming from the subdivision itself, faulty septic systems, illegal chemical dumping from landscaping operations, and runoff from the community's overtreated lawns. Margaret wasn't trying to protect the community from my ranch. She was trying to make me the scapegoat for environmental damage her own development had caused. And if she could force me to sell, the contaminated land would become my problem, not theirs. The lawsuit papers arrived on a Monday morning that started like any other. I was feeding the horses when a process server appeared at my gate, looking uncomfortable in his suit and tie as he navigated around the mud puddles. Elena Vasquez? You've been served. The document was 27 pages of legal threats wrapped in official language, but the message was clear. I had 30 days to comply with all HOA regulations or face foreclosure proceedings, legal fees, and daily fines of $500 until the property was brought into compliance. But buried in the attachments, I found something that made me smile for the first time in weeks. Margaret had overplayed her hand. The lawsuit included expert testimony from an environmental consultant who claimed my ranch was causing groundwater contamination. The consultant was Dr. Richard Fleming from Fleming Environmental Services, the same firm that had documented contamination coming from Willowbrook Estates itself. Dr. Fleming had filed 2 contradictory reports 6 months apart. In one, my ranch was pristine. In the other, it was an environmental disaster. Someone had paid him to change his professional opinion. I photocopied everything and locked the originals in my safe. Then I called Maria. "They've made a mistake," I told her. "A big one." "Tell me." "They're using falsified environmental reports to justify the lawsuit, but I have the originals showing the contamination is coming from their development, not my ranch." "Elena, that's fraud, conspiracy, and probably a half-dozen other felonies. And I can prove it." There was a long pause. "What do you need from me?" "Help me file a countersuit that's going to blow this whole thing wide open." While Maria worked on the legal strategy, I spent my evenings conducting the kind of investigation that only someone with access to county records could pull off. What I discovered was a criminal conspiracy that went far beyond my little ranch. Margaret and David Hensley had been running their land grab operation for 3 years. The pattern was always the same: identify valuable properties outside HOA jurisdiction, forge boundary expansion documents, target the owners with impossible compliance requirements, then swoop in to buy the properties at fire sale prices, when the owners couldn't afford the remediation costs. They'd stolen over 2,000 acres of prime real estate from 12 families, generating nearly $15 million in illegal profits. My ranch would be their 13th victim and their biggest payday yet. But the paper trail they'd left was damning. Every forged signature, every falsified environmental report, every backdated document was carefully preserved in the county files. Margaret had been so confident in her scheme that she'd never bothered to cover her tracks properly. I also discovered something else. 3 of the 5 county commissioners whose signatures she'd forged were personal friends of my grandfather. They'd attended his funeral 6 months ago, and they had no idea their names were being used to steal his legacy. Commissioner Patricia Ramirez had worked with my grandfather for years on agricultural policy. Commissioner James Murphy had bought cattle from our ranch for his own small farm. These weren't faceless bureaucrats. They were people who would be personally outraged by what Margaret had done. On Thursday evening, I made a series of phone calls that would set Margaret's world on fire. "Commissioner Ramirez? This is Elena Vasquez, Miguel's granddaughter. I need to show you something that's going to make you very angry." The emergency county commissioners meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I arrived early, carrying 3 file boxes of evidence and a presentation that would expose every detail of Margaret's criminal operation. Margaret was already there, sitting in the front row with David and their lawyer, looking confident and slightly annoyed at having to deal with what she probably assumed was a desperate last-ditch effort to save my ranch. Commissioner Ramirez called the meeting to order. "We're here to address irregularities in recent boundary expansion filings. Ms. Vasquez, you've requested time to present evidence to this commission?" "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." I stood up, looked directly at Margaret, and smiled. "Commissioners, I'm here to report a criminal conspiracy to defraud multiple property owners through the use of forged county documents, falsified environmental reports, and systematic intimidation designed to steal their land." Margaret's lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection. These are serious accusations without." "This isn't a courtroom," Commissioner Ramirez said firmly. "Let her present her evidence." For the next hour, I laid out the entire conspiracy. I showed the commissioners their forged signatures on documents they'd never seen. I presented the contradictory environmental reports, proving Dr. Fleming had been paid to lie. I displayed the financial records showing how the Hensleys had profited from their land grab operation. With each piece of evidence, I watched Margaret's face grow paler. By the time I finished, her confident smirk had been replaced by something approaching panic. "The boundary expansion that brought my ranch under HOA jurisdiction is based on fraudulent documents," I concluded. "These people have stolen over 2,000 acres from 12 families, and they're trying to make my ranch their 13th victim." Commissioner Murphy was the first to speak. "Margaret, what's your response to these allegations?" Margaret stood up slowly, her hands shaking as she gripped her purse. These, these accusations are completely unfounded. Miss Vasquez is obviously desperate to avoid complying with legitimate community standards. Ma'am, Commissioner Ramirez interrupted. This is my signature on a document I never signed. That's not about community standards. That's felony fraud. The room erupted. Margaret's lawyer was frantically whispering in her ear. David Hensley looked like he was planning escape routes. Other commissioners were demanding explanations. Through it all, I stood calmly watching Margaret's empire crumble around her. Commissioner Ramirez banged her gavel. This commission votes to immediately suspend all authority claimed by the Willowbrook Estates HOA over properties included in the March boundary expansion pending a full criminal investigation. Sheriff Martinez, are you present? Yes, ma'am. Please coordinate with the district attorney's office. We'll need warrants. As the meeting broke up, Margaret pushed past me toward the exit. But she couldn't resist one last threat. This isn't over, she hissed. You have no idea who you're messing with. I smiled back at her. Actually, Margaret, I know exactly who I'm messing with. The question is, do you know who you messed with? The FBI raided the Hensley house at dawn on Thursday morning. By the time I heard about it, they had already seized computers, financial records, and boxes of forged documents from both the house and Margaret's HOA office. Dr. Fleming was arrested at his environmental consulting firm, along with his business partner and their entire staff. The forged environmental reports were just the tip of the iceberg. They'd been falsifying studies for developers across 3 counties, helping them hide everything from toxic waste dumps to endangered species habitats. But the most satisfying moment came when I answered my doorbell that Friday evening and found Margaret standing on my porch, no longer the imperious HOA president, but a desperate woman facing federal fraud charges. Elena, we need to talk. No, we don't. Wait, please. I know we've had our differences, but… Differences? I laughed. Margaret, you tried to steal my ranch using forged county documents. You falsified environmental reports. You've been running a criminal conspiracy for 3 years. Those aren't differences. Those are felonies. Her composure finally cracked. You don't understand the pressure I was under. David's business was failing. We had debts. The development was hemorrhaging money from the environmental problems. So you decided to frame innocent families and steal their land? It wasn't supposed to hurt anyone. We were going to buy the properties at fair market value. 15 cents on the dollar isn't fair market value, Margaret. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her calculating one last desperate play. What do you want? She finally asked. Money? We could work out some kind of settlement. I want you in prison, I replied quietly. I want every family you stole from to get their land back. And I want you to understand that when you mess with someone's legacy, you better make sure they don't have the keys to every legal document in the county. Margaret's face hardened back into the mask of arrogance I'd come to hate. You think you've won? David has connections you can't imagine. Lawyers, judges, politicians. We'll beat this. Maybe. But while you're trying to beat federal fraud charges, I'll be living peacefully on the ranch my great-grandfather bought a century ago under the oak tree you tried to cut down. I closed the door and watched through the window as she stumbled back to her car, her perfect hair disheveled, her $1,000 outfit wrinkled and stained with tears. Rex nudged my hand with his nose, and I scratched behind his ears. Justice, boy. Sometimes it takes a while, but it always comes. The local news picked up the story first. HOA president arrested in land fraud scheme became the lead story on Channel 7 for 3 consecutive nights. The story had everything viewers loved: wealthy villains, innocent victims, and a David versus Goliath battle that ended with the little guy winning. But the real satisfaction came from watching the rest of Margaret's conspiracy unravel. Commissioner Bradley, who I'd initially suspected of being complicit, turned out to be another victim. He'd been receiving anonymous threats about his family if he didn't support community development initiatives. When he saw his forged signature on the boundary expansion documents, he broke down crying at the commission meeting. Dr. Fleming flipped on everyone to avoid federal prison. His testimony revealed that Margaret had been paying him $10,000 per falsified environmental report, and that similar operations were running in 4 other counties. The FBI estimated the total fraud at over $50 million. David Hensley tried to flee to the Cayman Islands, where he'd been hiding assets in offshore accounts. He was arrested at Houston Intercontinental Airport with 2 suitcases full of cash and a one-way ticket. Apparently, his connections weren't as powerful as Margaret had believed. The 12 families who'd lost their land to the scheme were finally vindicated. The Garcias got back their 40-acre horse property. The Johnsons reclaimed their family farm that had been in their family for 3 generations. Mrs. Chen, no relation to my supervisor, recovered the land where her late husband had planned to build their retirement home. Each victory felt personal. These weren't just legal wins, they were families getting their dreams back from people who'd tried to steal them. Margaret's trial began 6 months later in federal court. I was the star witness for the prosecution, spending 2 days on the stand explaining how I'd uncovered the conspiracy and walking the jury through every forged document, every falsified report, every illegal transaction. Margaret's defense attorney tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee with access to county records who'd fabricated evidence to avoid HOA compliance. It was a desperate strategy that fell apart the moment the prosecutor introduced the FBI's digital forensics analysis. Every forged signature had been scanned and analyzed. Every falsified environmental report had been traced back to its original version. Every financial transaction had been documented through bank records and accounting files. The evidence was overwhelming, but what sealed Margaret's fate was her own arrogance. Against her lawyer's advice, she insisted on testifying in her own defense. For 6 hours, she tried to convince the jury that she'd been the real victim, a dedicated community leader who'd been betrayed by corrupt consultants and manipulative property owners who refused to maintain community standards. The prosecutor's cross-examination was devastating. Mrs. Hensley, you testified that you never saw the original environmental reports showing contamination in your own development. Is that correct? That's correct. But you signed this purchase agreement for remediation services totaling $2.3 million to address that exact contamination, didn't you? Margaret's face went white as the prosecutor held up the document. That was. David handled the business side. Mrs. Hensley, this is your signature. The same signature that appears on this fraudulent boundary expansion document. Are you claiming someone forged both signatures? The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit fraud, forgery of government documents, racketeering, and money laundering. Margaret received 12 years in federal prison. David got 10 years. Dr. Fleming, who'd cooperated with the investigation, received 5 years and had to pay $3 million in restitution to his victims. Life returned to normal slowly. The HOA's authority over the boundary expansion properties was permanently revoked, and the Willowbrook Estates development itself was placed under federal oversight while the environmental contamination was addressed. I used some of the restitution money to finally repair the old stone farmhouse and build a proper workshop for the furniture restoration business I'd always dreamed of starting. The rest went into a legal fund to help other families fighting fraudulent HOA actions across the state. 6 months after the trial, I was working in my garden when I heard a familiar car coming up the driveway. Sheriff Martinez climbed out of his patrol car, but instead of his usual serious expression, he was grinning. "Elena, thought you'd want to hear this directly. Margaret Hensley was just denied parole. Seems she's been running a contraband operation from her prison cell, trying to smuggle cell phones to other inmates." I couldn't help but laugh. Some people never learn. There's more. Remember that environmental consulting firm Fleming Environmental Services? What about it? The FBI investigation revealed they were involved in similar fraud schemes in 7 states. Your case broke open the biggest environmental fraud ring in federal history. They're calling it the Texas Papers cases because of how you used county records to expose the whole operation. Standing there in my garden, surrounded by the vegetables Margaret had once called non-compliant under the oak tree she'd tried to destroy, I felt my grandfather's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. "Mija," I could almost hear him say, "this land is our legacy. Never let anyone take what belongs to us." I hadn't just saved my ranch. I'd saved a piece of history that would be here for my children and grandchildren, protected by the same laws and records that had helped me expose the truth. 2 years later, I was featured in a documentary called David V's Goliath, Fighting HOA Fraud that aired on Netflix. The filmmakers interviewed all the families who'd recovered their land, the FBI agents who'd worked the case, and even some of the jurors from Margaret's trial. But the moment I'm most proud of wasn't caught on camera. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning when I was sitting on my porch, drinking coffee and watching the sunrise paint the hills gold. A young woman drove up my driveway in a beat-up Honda, looking nervous and desperate. "Are you Elena Vasquez?" she asked as she got out of the car. "That's me. My name is Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen from your case. I live in Austin, and my HOA is trying to take my house. They're claiming I owe $50,000 in fines for violations I never committed, and they're threatening foreclosure." She pulled out a folder full of documents. "I heard about what you did with the county records. Would you be willing to look at my case? I don't know who else to turn to." I invited her in for coffee and spent 3 hours reviewing her documents. By the end of the morning, I'd identified 5 forged signatures, 2 backdated violation notices, and a pattern of financial irregularities that screamed fraud. "Sarah," I said as she prepared to leave, "you're not just dealing with an overzealous HOA. You're dealing with criminals, and I know exactly how to expose them." Her eyes filled with tears. "You'll help me?" "Honey, I'm just getting started. Margaret Hensley thought she could steal my ranch because I was one person fighting the system. She never realized that sometimes one person with the right knowledge can take down the whole damn system." As Sarah's Honda disappeared down my driveway, I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the contacts I'd built over the past 2 years: FBI agents, federal prosecutors, investigative journalists, and dozens of families who'd fought similar battles against corrupt HOAs. Margaret had been the beginning, not the end. There were more predators out there, more families being victimized, more legacies being stolen by people who thought their money and connections made them untouchable. But they'd made the same mistake Margaret had made. They'd underestimated the power of one person who knew where the bodies were buried, literally and figuratively in the county records. I walked back to my porch, sat down in my grandfather's rocking chair, and looked out at the land that 4 generations of my family had called home. The oak tree's branches swayed in the morning breeze, its leaves whispering the same secrets they'd always whispered. But now they had a new story to tell about the day Elena Vasquez declared war on the HOA industrial complex and won. Rex jumped up on the porch and settled at my feet, his tail wagging as he watched a red-tailed hawk circle high above the pasture. In the distance, My horses grazed peacefully in fields that would never again be threatened by people who mistook greed for authority. My phone buzzed with a text message from Maria. Saw the documentary. Proud of you, Prima. When's the next case? I smiled and typed back. Just got one. Time to go hunting again. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. And this time, I wasn't fighting alone.